Well, thank you, Carl, for getting us off to such a good start. I'd like to begin this part of our program with 4 words I first learned as a 12-year-old at Neil Josephson's house in the Midwood section of Brooklyn, New York. These 4 words evoke the suffering of yesterday and the hope of tomorrow. Next year in Jerusalem. Thank you for being here. All of us at AEI are grateful to all of you, our supporters and friends, fellow scholars and trustees. It is a very good thing to gather together at this pivotal time for our country. And we are here tonight to honor Paul Gigot, an outstanding journalist and American public intellectual, and also a steadfast friend of AEI. Paul has captained the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal since 2001. As Vermont Royster, who had Paul's job during the 1960s, was fond of saying, the Journal is the only newspaper that people buy for the editorials. And all of us at AEI commune with those editorials on a daily basis. And when we do, we commune with Paul Gigot. Under Paul's leadership, the Journal's editorial pages have defended without compromise the American tradition of freedom and ordered liberty against all opponents, whether from the left or from the right. And he's defended these non-negotiable principles, which are also our principles, with common sense, optimism, panache, and wit. As the Journal editorial page has recognized, its commitments to, quote, a tradition of vigorous, reasoned discourse and the principles of free people and free markets are more important than ever in what is a culture of growing progressive conformity and intolerance. Cancel culture and identity politics reject America's founding premises, that we are all created equal and deserve to be judged by our character and not by our ethnic or racial background. As major media outlets and culture institutions succumb to woke ideology, we are lucky to have someone like Paul exposing identity politics for what it really is, crude political tribalism. In Paul's words, a politics fixed on indelible differences will inevitably lead to resentments. Now, it pains me to say this, but elements of the right are increasingly just like the left in their rejection of America's founding principles for the politics of grievance. If the left sees white privilege and racism under every rock, the fevered right talks of nothing but stolen elections and the deep state. The call for open borders on one side is matched by scapegoating of all immigrants on the other. A desire for government to pay for everything on the left is matched by the resistance on the isolationist right to pay even for a war that keeps the flame of freedom burning in Europe. Resisting this trend, this hyper-partisan, us against them, apocalyptic worldview is one of our central tasks at AEI. And our scholars are fortunate to have such an ally in the editorial pages of the Journal. Paul, it should be said, highlighted these dangers early. He wasn't just eloquent, he was farsighted. On the eve of the 2016 election, he identified the risks of the, quote, brooding resentments that too often veer into white identity politics. That same editorial warned that candidate Trump's, quote, bromance with Vladimir Putin's is especially troubling. Trump's instincts to retreat to a fortress America, Paul cautioned, could invite more aggression from Russia, China, and Iran. Here's a way to summarize the challenge we face. Too many on the right equivocate in the face of Putin's aggression, and too many on the left excuse Hamas's terrorism. As Paul's editorials make clear, these threats demand moral clarity and total commitment. Now, it would be easy to brood in the face of these challenges, easy indeed to embrace despair. But more than anything else, the Journal's editorial pages stiffen our resolve, reminding us of the enduring strength and potential of America's people and its principle. This is a big part of why Paul is so deserving as the recipient of this year's Irving Kristol Award. We are living in a moment that demands seriousness and clarity, and most of all, courage. That's what AEI scholars bring to their work, and it's also what Paul brings to his. So let me say this plainly. There are times in the lives of nations when there is no excuse for ignoring hard realities or being frivolous or careless, and we are painfully in such a time now. This is a time to say a few things clearly, that America must stand with Ukraine without losing its nerve or its backbone and help our allies push back the forces of chaos and aggression. That we must stand with Israel against the savagery and evil it confronts and give no ground to moral equivalence, vacillation, or nihilism. Sometimes peace just simply requires victory on the ground. That we must confront and oppose anti-Semitism, which has reared its ancient ugly head again, and must see clearly that defending freedom and opposing violent bigotry are the same fight for the same cause and are equally and totally essential. And more generally, that we must see the world with clear eyes, without despair and without wishful thinking, but with a confidence rooted in our faith in our Constitution and in America's long-proven ability to overcome even the toughest challenges. These commitments and values are a hallmark of Paul Gigot's work. America is lucky to have such an unwavering advocate for freedom, limited government, human dignity, and American leadership. And we at AEI are grateful to have such an admirable ally in the fight to defend these principles. So I now invite Paul Gigot to the podium to thank him for all that he has done for our country.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that, Robert, for that generous introduction. It's really an honor to be here to receive this recognition in the name of Irving Kristol. And from AEI, which has done so much for, if I can use the phrase, free markets and free people, which is what we believe in at the Wall Street Journal. Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for your leadership, and all of you at AEI. And thank you, Karl Rove, I think. All I can say is now you know why we have fact checkers at the Wall Street Journal. I know Karl for about 35 years, and most of that time I was really listening, I was covering politics and had to listen to his spin. He spun me about all the great things that the people he was working for were doing, like the McCain-Feingold bill. So I can tell you there are a few satisfactions in my job that are greater than getting the revenge of being his editor. Now, I'm a newspaper man by trade, and a newspaper is a collaboration. It's a community. It's a community of writers, readers, and ideas. And I've been taught and elevated by that community across my career, which of course includes all of my colleagues, former and current, at the Wall Street Journal, and I thank them. It includes our proprietors, first the Bancrofts, and then for the last 16 years, Rupert Murdoch, and now Lachlan Murdoch. They've supported us when CEOs and Wall Street Journal reporters and even presidents of the United States are unhappy with us, which is quite often as it happens. This community includes nearly everyone in this room. here tonight. I've learned from all of you at one time or another. So many of you have graced our pages with your work. I hope you will continue to do that, and I thank you for that. And I especially appreciate my sources. You know who you are. Now, Irving Kristol was one of the great contributors to the journal, as was his wife, Bea. And I first met Irving in the late 1980s when he told me that he had heard that I was going to write a political column. In that blunt way Irving had, he said, now there are two kinds of Washington columns. There's the great analytical column. That's very hard to do. George Will can do it. Charles Krauthammer can do it. You should not do that kind of a column. After that candid assessment of my capabilities, he said, there is also the reported column. You should do that. And so I took his advice. And then he added, oh, and never write about the press. I said, why? Why not? It's part of the story. And he said, because there's no future in it. Think about it. I did not take that advice. And in fact, I've subcontracted the job of writing about the press to Holman Jenkins on my team, who does a terrific job, I must say. In thinking about what I would say tonight, I look back at what my predecessor and mentor, Bob Bartley, said in 2002 upon his retirement. He surveyed his 30 years across his editorship and looked at the progress we had all made. We had won the Cold War, we'd beaten stagflation, quieted the convulsions of the 60s and the 70s. Here's what Bob wrote. What I think I've learned over 30 years is that in this society, rationality wins out, progress happens, and problems have solutions. This, I like to think, is what happens when a society incorporates the editorial credo of my newspaper, free markets and free people. In that kind of a society, optimism pays. He had cause to claim that vindication. But 21 years later, almost to the day, I wish I could say the same thing. Most of the victories that Bob celebrated have eroded or vanished. I won't relate the litany of the backsliding, you know it well, but then Bob predicted that too. His book, The 7 Fat Years About Supply-Side Economics, made clear that peace and prosperity are contingent, that the 7 fat years in the Bible followed 7 lean years, that the Belle Epoque of the early 20th century, with its rising peace and prosperity, soon gave way to World War I, Stalin, Hitler, and Tojo. Now, this is a lesson that conservatives understand. Progressives, and God bless them, believe that the arc of the moral universe is long and bends toward justice. In that phrase Barack Obama liked to use, quoting Martin Luther King, Jr. Sometimes it does, but it takes an awful lot of human agency. Progressives believe that human nature can be molded like soft clay. Conservatives, on the other hand, well, we believe in human nature. We know that things can get worse, and they probably will. The essayist Joseph Epstein reviewed a book on prosperity in the journal some years ago about pessimism. And the headline summed up a certain conservative disposition, the upbeat pessimist. The world may get better, but you better not count on it. This is the disposition another journal editor, Vermont Royster, explained to me when I went to interview him for the 100th anniversary of the Wall Street Journal in 1989. I asked Roy if, after all he had seen in his career, if he were an optimist or a pessimist. He said, well, I'm a short-term pessimist, but I'm a long-term optimist, as long as you define the long term as 500 years. With upbeat pessimism in mind, I want to address one of our current troubles, which is urgent, but I think also solvable, and that is the decline of America's defenses, military and political. This weakness has been exposed in sharp relief in the last 2 years, and it is worse than even most Americans know. We are facing an array of adversaries that is more formidable than any time since World War II, and we are not prepared, I fear, for the moment. In 2019, in a visit to the White House, I was invited to meet with a senior foreign policy official. The conversation included a discussion about Iranian aid for Venezuela, we were then trying to oust President Maduro, and Iran was helping with oil supplies. I asked, have you considered interdicting the supplies with ships? We have, this official said, but the nearest ship we could find was a Dutch frigate in the middle of the Atlantic. This is not Ronald Reagan's Navy, he said. Recently, I spoke with the U.S. ambassador in Asia, who, noting the balance of military power against China, said, the way we have let our defenses decline is criminal. The war in Ukraine has taught us that our defense production lines are inadequate, our long-range anti-ship missiles would run out in a week in a war with Taiwan. We trail Russia and China on hypersonic weapons, or consider one example from the US Navy. The Navy's attack submarines are the best deterrent we have against a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The Navy says it needs 66 hulls, yet only 31 were operationally ready this past fiscal year. To satisfy the Navy's needs and meet our AUKUS commitments, we would have to build an average of at least 2.3 subs a year. We are building 1.2. I could cite many such examples, but you get the point. The relevant questions are, how did we get here and what do we do about it? The answer to the first question is that we forgot the lesson of history. One of my military mentors was the great Andy Marshall, the legendary Pentagon strategist, who liked to say that peace is best understood as an interlude between wars. Robert Gates issued a similar warning as he retired as defense secretary in 2011, when he said that when wars end, the US invariably makes the mistake of drawing down our defenses and leaving ourselves vulnerable. We did it again. So what do we do now? The obvious initial answer is to spend more on defense and to do it soon. But that's the easy part of the answer. We know the policy solution. The harder issue is finding the political will to do it, while persuading adversaries that we are credible enough to restore American deterrence. And we have learned in Ukraine and now in the Middle East that US deterrence has faded, and the world's rogues are on the march. On this score, my worry is less about the political left than it is about some of our friends on the right. Modern progressives will always put the welfare state above defenses because that is their governing model and philosophy. They believe in the restraining power of international treaties and arms control. They believe our adversaries will be deterred by Americans' forbearance or the persuasiveness of our good example. They will never rebuild our defenses without pressure from the political right. And what worries me these days is a lack of unity and resolve on the right. That includes the return of conservative isolationism. The proponents of this view would not identify themselves with that term, but I think their policies justify it. Senators, think tank leaders, Silicon Valley billionaires with a podcast, even presidential candidates argue in some way or another in favor of a US retreat from the world. They start by saying that defending Ukraine is not in our interests. But listen, and I think you can hear where this goes. Next, they say we should consider withdrawing from NATO or South Korea. They're willing to support Israel, at least for now, but I'm not sure that will last if it means engaging war in the Middle East. Yes, the new isolationists say America must be engaged in some conflicts, just not the ones we are engaged in at the current moment. For them, our real national interests are always somewhere else. What is most striking is how much this isolationism of the right resembles the traditional isolationism of the left. Isolationists in the Vietnam era argued that America wasn't good enough for the world. We were baby killers and imperialists. This is the view of today's pro-Hamas left. As Charles Krauthammer pointed out 20 years ago, the conservative isolationism that flourished in the 1930s argued the opposite, that America was too good for the world. Our Republican values shouldn't be tarnished by the bloody intrigues of Europe or Asia. But the new isolationists on the right now agree, or many of them do, with the left that the US doesn't deserve to lead the world. They say we are too degraded culturally and too weak fiscally to play the role we did during the Cold War. They say we are too woke and too broke. There is an element of truth to this critique. We are neither as culturally united nor as fiscally sound as we were in the 1980s. But this is not an adequate excuse for an American retreat from the world. And it cannot be an excuse for failing to protect national security, which is the first obligation of government. The fiscal objection is simply false. Our defense spending is at a historic post-World War II low. As a share of the economy, we can afford to spend more on defenses, even at our present levels of national debt. In the last 2 years alone, the Biden Democrats spent $11.6 trillion on things other than defense. Yes, $11.6 trillion. We can make spending choices. We can decide between guns and butter. Yet the same conservatives, many of them who say we can't spend more on defense because we are broke, also say we cannot reform entitlements because it is too difficult. This is political surrender. It is exactly the corner that Barack Obama and the political left have wanted to back us into. As for being too woke, that battle is not lost. It is being fought by parents in school districts across the country. It is being fought by those resisting the politicized ESG agenda for business. Some of you in this room, I know. And I suspect that the shock of the pro-Hamas protests on college campuses will awaken more Americans to the anti-American corruption of many of our universities. We have also been here before with the military. In the 1970s, after Vietnam, morale and recruiting hit a low point. But an officer corps that included Colin Powell and Jack Keane helped to revive the esprit and the reputation of the armed forces. Within a decade, the military of dope and defeat was the military of Top Gun. Today, the Marines are still meeting their recruiting quotas by resisting identity politics and putting sacrifice and discipline first. I must acknowledge another problem here, and that is the legacy of our failed interventions abroad, especially Iraq. Those of us who supported that intervention promised more than the US delivered. More, it turned out, than we were capable of delivering to societies that didn't want to hear what we were selling. Based on what we knew at the time, or what we thought we knew, There is still a reasonable defense for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Iraq is no longer a regional or global menace. The Gulf Arabs have had to choose between Iran and a US-backed Israel, and they have been choosing Israel, at least they did before the Hamas invasion. But the Iraq occupation was botched, the cost was too high, and the political consequences have been destructive. I'll admit my own role here. I spent my 20s in Asia as a reporter covering the democratic revolutions in the Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan. Those successes filled me with too much optimism about the potential for democratic change. I knew too little about Arab and Muslim society and underestimated the challenges in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those troubled interventions have now become a political veto, the way Vietnam once was for the American left. No more nation building, as they say. But we are not nation building in Israel or Iran. Israel is trying to preserve itself as a nation. Ukrainians are fighting to preserve their nascent democracy and to join the West, like Poland and the Baltic states. It is more than a little ironic that the same people who criticize the intervention in Iraq for seeking to promote democracy now criticize aid to Ukraine because that country isn't a perfect democracy. As Arthur Herman has pointed out, in Israel and Ukraine, we are also defending Western civilization. Israel is an outpost of the West, a descendant of the heritage of Athens and Jerusalem, among neighbors who would destroy it precisely because of that heritage. Ukraine aspires to be the same. In helping them defend themselves, we are also defending our founding principles. And we are helping them with weapons, not with American troops. Different interventions overseas need to be judged on their own terms. For 2 decades, the left had its Vietnam syndrome against US intervention abroad. Now the right is developing an Iraq syndrome that is equally as mistaken. Which brings me to the politics of isolationism. History shows it's a political loser for whichever party adopts it. In the 1930s, the Republicans resisted what they called foreign entanglements, even as Hitler rose in Germany and the militarists rose in Japan. Senator Gerald Nye and the Republicans devoted their energy to investigating American weapons makers. They voted for the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37. They even opposed Lend-Lease to Britain. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, Republicans were discredited politically for a decade, and it might have been longer if they hadn't nominated Eisenhower in 1952. Democrats suffered a similar fate after they became the party of Come Home America during and after Vietnam. They slashed aid to South Vietnam in 1975, and Saigon soon fell. Democratic hawks became Republican neoconservatives, and Republicans dominated the White House for a generation until the end of the Cold War. I fear Republicans are inviting a similar fate now if they abandon Ukraine to Russia, or if they withdraw from NATO, or if they signal to China that Taiwan is too distant from our shores to defend. The disorder that results from that abdication will be blamed on those who refuse to deter it, and America will eventually be drawn into conflicts as a result of that disorder in any case. I'm not arguing for willy-nilly intervention. We must pick our spots. Prudence is a conservative virtue abroad as much as it is at home. We should also not fight wars that we are not willing to do what it takes to win. But when friends are asking for help to defend themselves, we should make sure we have the strength and the weapons to help them and defend ourselves in the bargain. I'll end by addressing the popular new line of many on the right. Perhaps you've heard it. Do you know what time it is? They say, It's intended as an insult, as in stop invoking Ronald Reagan, old man, and get with the 21st century. But this is the wrong question. The right question is, what time do you want it to be? Do you want it to be the 1930s when America watched from afar as dictators began to march? We pretended we were safe, only to be attacked with our guard down. It took 4 years and 400,000 dead Americans to win that war. This isn't yet the 1930s, but it will arrive soon enough on our present course. Or would you prefer this time to be like the 1970s and the 1980s, when the American right united behind a mission of rearmament, economic revival, and renewed national purpose? When we won the Cold War and ushered in 2 decades of prosperity? So my counsel this evening is, don't believe the pessimists who say we can't do it again. Stick with the upbeat pessimists who know we can do it if we rally the political will to do it. Thank you very much for listening.